If you likes listening to apologists give examples of how to manipulate a conversation, today is your lucky day, because Greg's going to give us a whole bunch of leading questions that he thinks is going to give believers a jump start on their evangelism efforts. And we's going to answer every single one. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. Last time we started looking at Chapter 7, in which Greg teaches his readers how to use leading questions to dominate a conversation and reverse the burden of proof. And along the way, he tried to pull a fast one and make it sound like folks who advocate tolerance is actually being intolerant. But, of course, we didn't let him get away with that little bit of dishonesty. Tolerance is for people, not for things, and definitely not for hateful, bigoted dogmas. So picking up where we left off, Greg spends a paragraph or three talking about how it can be hard to spot any flaws in skeptical arguments. And as an ex-Christian myself, I can sympathize. I've worn both hats, and I can say from personal experience that it's a lot easier to find flaws in apologetic arguments, so I don't envy Greg his job of trying to do the same thing the other way around. Greg's advice is, quote, look, observe, reflect. Maybe your friend's comments have tipped you off to some problem with his view. Is there a misstep, a non sequitur, a fallacy, or a failing of some sort? Can you challenge any underlying assumptions that might be faulty? Whatever flaw you discover, be sure to address the problem with a question, not a statement. End quote. And except for the part about asking questions, that's advice that's going to be a lot easier for the skeptic to apply to the apologist than the other way around. And I think Greg knows that, which is why he'd rather be the one asking the questions. The problem for Greg is that skeptics questions their assumptions all the time, and if they find any assumptions that's wrong, they just admit it and replace the bad assumptions with better ones. Christians, on the other hand, has all kinds of assumptions, like assuming that the Bible is the Word of God instead of acknowledging that it's claims made by men about God, or assuming that any magical claims can be adequately justified by assigning them to some unfalsifiable supernatural realm, or assuming that atheists really believe in God and is just denying his existence out of spite because they want to sin. And unlike skeptics, believers can't afford to admit that any of their assumptions is wrong, so they can't ever replace the bad ones with better ones. Scratch any apologetics argument, even the tiniest bit, and all these assumptions comes pouring out. So Greg says, ask questions instead of giving folks honest apologetics arguments. Or at least, not till you and Lieutenant Columbo has used leading questions to stack the conversational deck in your favor. And even then, it's kind of iffy. Quote, remember, as an ambassador for Christ, you don't have to hit a home run in every conversation. You don't even have to get on base. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes just getting up to bat will do. End quote. Greg knows how hard it is to find flaws in skeptical arguments, so he's careful to set his readers' expectations low. And by the way, Jesus didn't do that. In fact, in Luke 21:15, Jesus promised his disciples, quote, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. End quote. Quite a contrast, ain't it? Of course, if Jesus actually kept that promise, folks like Greg would be out of a job. Who needs a book on tactics when you's filled with the infinite wisdom of Almighty God, am I right? But it don't actually work that way in real life, and Greg knows it, so he's set his readers' expectations low. Greg closes Chapter 7 with a section that he entitles, Innocent as Doves, although given the content of this section, he might as well have called it How to Fake Sincerity. In it, he gives 3 ways believers can use questions to, quote, soften the challenge, unquote, instead of facing issues head on. And he gives several questions as examples for each technique. Technique number 1 is to use a question to suggest an alternative. And here's his examples. Quote, have you ever considered that if the Bible was merely written by men, it would be hard to account for fulfilled prophecy? How would you explain that? End quote. But fortunately, I don't have to account for fulfilled prophecy. All I has to account for is the fact that Christians believe that prophecies has been fulfilled. And that's easy. Believers believe because they wants to believe. Take Isaiah 7:14, for example. The text says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." And Matthew 1:23 says this was fulfilled by the birth of Jesus, even though Mary named her son Jesus and not Emmanuel. Christians don't care that the names don't match because they wants to believe in fulfilled prophecy. So they just ignores the parts that don't fit. They believe because they want to believe. Next question, quote, "Have you ever considered the difficulty involved in adding something like the teaching on Jesus' divinity to every existing handwritten copy of the New Testament circulating in the Roman world by the 4th century? How is this physically possible?" End quote. No, I ain't considered it because nobody who knows what they's talking about has ever suggested anything remotely like that. The divinity of Jesus is something modern Christians believe in because they wants to believe it. So they take ambiguous passages in the New Testament and interpret them in ways that weren't universally accepted in the early church. It took literally centuries for the majority of the church to decide what official doctrine was, and even then it weren't universally accepted. And the reason it took so long is because it weren't a question of what was written in the New Testament, it was a question of how to interpret what was written in the New Testament. This business about supposedly altering the text itself is a red herring and a straw man. Next question, quote, "Have you ever considered that the existence of evil is actually evidence for the existence of God, not against it?" End quote. Yes, I've considered that claim extensively, and it's a bogus claim based on a naive and superstitious understanding of morality. We've discussed this one in great detail before, so I won't belabor the point, but the gist of it is that the existence of what we call evil is a social consensus that don't require any supernatural authority issuing any kind of moral law. All it takes is material consequences that folks generally agree is undesirable. Next question, quote, "Have you ever considered that if abortion is okay, it's going to be hard to condemn infanticide since the baby's location inside the womb, abortion, or outside the womb, infanticide, is the only difference between the two? How can mere location be relevant to the baby's value?" End quote. This one's built on a lot of false assumptions, if not outright falsehoods. First of all, fetuses ain't babies. A fetus has a placenta and a baby don't. And the reason the fetus has a placenta is because it ain't a complete person yet. It needs extra biological support to complete the process, and that support comes from the placenta. Second, when women is allowed to manage their own reproductive health according to the best available medical science, most abortion happens before the developing embryo even reaches the fetal stage, and maybe even before it reaches the embryonic stage. And there's lots of differences between a zygote and a baby besides just location. Thirdly, this question omits the whole issue of forced pregnancy, which is a form of violent sexual assault against the woman. And sexual assault ain't okay. If you wants to oppose abortion, your only ethical option is to support comprehensive sex education and freely available contraception so as women can have sex without getting unwanted pregnancies in the first place. No unwanted pregnancies means no abortions except in a case of medical necessity. And if you ain't willing to prevent unwanted pregnancies by any means possible, you ain't anti-abortion, you's pro-sexual assault, and you deserve to be held accountable for it. Not that any of this has anything to do with whether or not God is real. Next question, quote, "Have you ever considered that if Jesus was wrong about being the only way of salvation, it's difficult to call him a good man, a prophet, or a wise religious teacher? What do you think about that problem?" End quote. Well, I don't think it's a problem. Christians has built up this legendary Jesus and assigned all sorts of noble virtues to him, but originally he was just a failed apocalyptic preacher. This notion that you has to praise Jesus in order to be a good person ain't nothing but a credulous Christian conceit, and the sooner we shed this self-serving flattery, the better our society will be. Mythology aside, Jesus weren't above reproach, and we need to be able to look at the bad as well as the good if we want an accurate and historical understanding of where he come from and what he really accomplished. Greg's next batch of questions is designed to show how you can phrase a leading question in order to pretend like you're just asking for a clarification. Quote, "Can you clear this up for me? If Jesus' divinity was an invention of the church in the early 4th century, how do you explain all the references to a divine Christ in Christian literature written before that time?" End quote. You see what he did there? He started by saying, "Can you clear this up for me?" as if he was just asking for a clarification instead of asking a leading question. He thinks he's being sneaky, but really he's just being clumsy. We can all see that he's asking the leading question, and we ain't fooled by the fact that he started off as if he was asking for a clarification. All he's accomplishing is making himself sound disingenuous. As for the question itself, two things. No, the notion of some kind of divine Jesus weren't first invented in the early 4th century. Christians was arguing about whether Jesus was divine for centuries before that. Some folks like Justin Martyr believed that he was a lesser deity below God but above the angels. Some folks believed he was an ordinary man indwelt by God, and various other folks had various other opinions. It's true, though, that the uniquely Trinitarian interpretation of Christ's divinity is something they didn't come up with until the early 4th century. Before that, it was a lot of chaos, which is part of the reason why they had to hold the Council of Nicaea. And the reason for all this confusion is because all them references that Greg refers to is passages that different early Christians understood in different ways. In John 10:30, for example, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," which modern believers understand as a clear declaration of the deity of Christ. But in John 17:22, Jesus prays for all believers and asks, quote, "that they may be one even as we are one," end quote. So clearly, being one with God ain't necessarily the same as being God yourselves. It's ambiguous, and different folks understands it in different ways, and they always has. Next question. Quote, "Can you help me understand this? If there is no evidence that life came from non-life, that life arose spontaneously from inanimate matter to kick off the sequence of evolution, and there is much evidence against it, how can you say that Darwinian evolution is a fact?" End quote. So 2 questions, 2 answers. In answer to the first question, can I help you understand? Well, maybe not. It's extraordinarily difficult to get someone to understand things they ain't willing to understand. But for the sake of argument, let's assume they's at least willing to listen. In answer to the second question, first we has to address all the false assumptions and misinformation in the original question. It ain't true that there's no evidence in favor of abiogenesis, nor is it true that there's any evidence against it. There's evidence against spontaneous generation, which creationists frequently confuse with abiogenesis, but there ain't no evidence against abiogenesis per se. Now, a lot of the evidence for abiogenesis gets into advanced organic chemistry, which most folks ain't equipped to properly understand. But there's simpler evidence, too, that most folks should find accessible. Consider the consequences that would reasonably and naturally follow if life arose from non-life. What would we expect to see? Well, we'd expect to see some traces of that developmental process. Things that ain't strictly life and ain't strictly non-life. Viruses, for example, or prions, or amino acids occurring outside the cells and such. And we do see those things. Or consider what it takes for life to continue. When we eat to stay alive, in most cases our food ain't alive. It's inanimate. And even if something was alive when we ate it, the process of eating would kill it before we digested it. We don't need life to maintain life. Instead, we consume inanimate matter, which our bodies build into living cells. And that's consistent with life being a material process, which in turn is consistent with a materialistic origin for life. If life was some kind of magical spiritual substance, we would not expect that a purely materialistic process would be necessary to keep it going. But it all makes perfect sense if life itself is a material process. And all that said, the origin of life on Earth is irrelevant to whether or not new species arise by descent with modification from common ancestors. So that bit at the end about how can you say evolution is a fact is completely tangential. Next question. Quote, "Can you help me with something that confuses me? How does having a burning in the bosom about the Book of Mormon give adequate evidence that this book is from God when people have similar reasons, a strong personal conviction from God in response to prayer, for rejecting it? End quote. And I almost skipped this one because clearly Greg is describing a conversation with a Mormon missionary, or at least a Mormon giving their personal testimony, and of course I ain't here to defend Mormonism. On the other hand, this one's kind of fun in a first remove the log from your own eye kind of way. Greg is so intent on rejecting Mormonism that he completely forgets the role that the supposed testimony of the Holy Spirit is supposed to play in his own religion. Back in chapter 3, he wrote, quote, "If you want skeptics to believe in the Bible, don't get into tug-of-war with them about inspiration. Instead, invite them to engage Jesus' words firsthand, then let the Spirit do the heavy lifting for you." End quote. And Greg ain't the only apologist who talks like that. William Lane Craig writes, quote, "You can know that God exists and that Christianity is true wholly apart from arguments simply through the inner testimony of God to your heart." End quote. When apologists challenge the reliability of a Mormon's personal inner testimony, they's calling a kettle black. They got no right to claim the moral or intellectual high ground here because they makes the exact same claims on their own terms. So Dr. Koukl, let me help you with your confusion here. The reason the inner testimony of the Spirit of God says different and contradictory things to different folks is because he's imaginary. What believers perceive as being some kind of inner experience of God is just them responding to autosuggestion, peer influence, and wishful thinking. That's why when God speaks to you, he can't tell you nothing that you couldn't know or guess on your own. He can't tell you the serial number on the dollar bill in my pocket. He can't tell you when and where the next terrorist attack is going to be. And apparently, for something like 80% of evangelical voters, he can't even tell them that Donald Trump is a fraud who's exploiting them for personal gain. That's why it ain't a reliable source of information for Mormons, nor for you neither. The next question is openly homophobic. Quote, "If homosexuality is truly natural, then why did nature give homosexual men bodies designed for reproductive sex with women and then give them desires for sex with men? Why would nature give desires for one type of sex but a body for another?" End quote. And I left off the tiresome pretense that Greg is just looking for clarification because I think we've seen enough of that kind of duplicity already. This here question is Exhibit A in the case against the claim that there ain't no such thing as a stupid question. It's a stupid question because it's designed to prevent folks from learning important ideas instead of giving them the opportunity to do so. This is like asking, if the human mouth and anus is naturally designed to be exactly the right size and shape to hold a penis, why did nature give men the desire to have sex with women? I mean, come on. The fallacy here is what I call the single-purpose fallacy, which is the notion that if you think a certain body part is designed to have a certain function, then you must use it for that specific function and only for that function. Which is horse apples, of course. There's lots of body parts with multiple functions and lots of things about our bodies that ain't dictated by what quote-unquote nature supposedly intended. Clothes, for example, ain't natural at all. Neither is shaving and cutting your hair. Kids reach physical sexual maturity long before they's old enough to handle it responsibly, but that don't mean that we somehow violate nature's design by making them wait. We use the same mouth to breathe and to eat and to talk, but that don't mean that one of them three things is the correct function of the mouth and that all the others is unnatural. Our eyelids blink to protect our eyes and keep them moistened, but we also use them to wink, and there ain't nothing wrong with that. Body parts can serve more than one function, and we can use our bodies in ways that ain't strictly dictated by quote-unquote nature, or at least by somebody's idea of what nature supposedly wants. As for why homosexual men have penises, well, why wouldn't they? The biological factors that determine your genitals is different from the biological factors that determine your sexuality. Usually they stay in sync, but ain't nothing to guarantee that they always do. There's even a rare condition called Swyer syndrome where you have XY chromosomes, but you develop fully functional female genitalia. You don't even know you's genetically male until you go to a doctor to find out how come you can't get pregnant. So no, ain't nothing surprising about related systems developing in different and apparently conflicting ways. Nature's a complex, undirected, unreasoning process, and it ain't always obvious why it works the way it do, but that don't mean that there's necessarily anything wrong with what it does. It's just the way things are. Greg's last batch of questions ain't even a list of questions. It's just a bunch of vague generalities you can use when you can't think of a good question. Stuff like, I'm not sure I agree with the way you put it, and let me suggest an alternative, and such. And okay, I guess, at least it ain't Columbo, so that's a step up. And that wraps up Chapter 7. Overall, it's been a masterclass in how to be patronizing, smug, manipulative, and disingenuous, all in the name of Jesus. As an atheist and a skeptic, I has mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, this is a really bad approach to evangelism and runs a huge risk of coming off as fake and self-righteous. And honestly, I'm kind of a fan of poor quality, ineffective evangelism because it slows the spread of religious belief. On the other hand, as a potential target for this kind of evangelism, I was definitely not a fan because this kind of stuff can be unbelievably tiresome and pointless, and I've got better things to do with my time, and I'm sure you do too. But anyways, I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to wrap it up for me for today. Next time, we're going to open up Chapter 8 entitled, wait for it, Perfecting Columbo. The title of this book is Tactics, plural, but at this point I'm beginning to doubt if there's really more than one here. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.